My name is Erin Wallace. I'm 29 years old. Last night, I walked into a rooftop bar in downtown Chicago and saw something I was never supposed to see. Across the room, under dim lights and the glow of the skyline, my father was sitting there with another woman. He was leaning in, smiling like nothing else mattered. His hand wrapped around hers like it belonged there. For a second, I thought I was mistaken. I stared longer, waiting for my mind to correct itself, but it didn't. My chest tightened, my hands went cold, and I couldn't look away. I didn't confront him. I didn't think. I just pulled out my phone and started recording. Every second felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart in front of me. When I stopped the video, my hands were shaking so badly. I almost dropped my phone. I stared at the screen, then sent it to my mother with a single message. "You need to see this." 15 minutes later, she walked in. And what happened after that didn't just change one night. It changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Before I tell you what really happened, I want you to pause for a second. Tell me what time it is where you are right now, and what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story reaches. And if stories like this pull you in, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment, because this one only gets more intense from here. Earlier that evening, nothing about her plans felt unusual. Erin had suggested going out after weeks of putting it off, and even she didn't expect herself to say it out loud. Life had been steady but distant, filled with routines that kept her moving without really feeling anything. Her husband noticed the change immediately when she mentioned it, the way she said it without hesitation, like she had already made up her mind before speaking. He agreed without asking too many questions, which was something she quietly appreciated. Their evenings together had become predictable over time. Meals at home, quiet conversations that never went too deep, and long stretches of silence that neither of them tried to fix. It wasn't that something was wrong. It was just that nothing felt alive anymore. That night felt different from the start, not because anything dramatic had happened yet, but because she had chosen to step out of that routine for once. She picked the place without overthinking it, a rooftop bar known for its view, somewhere people went to feel like they were part of something bigger than their daily lives. On the way there, she stayed quiet, watching the city pass by through the window, lights stretching across the streets, people moving with purpose she didn't feel connected to. Her husband tried to make small talk, asking simple questions about her day, but her answers stayed short, not cold, just distant. There was something else on her mind, something she didn't say, something that had been there for years. Growing up, Erin had learned early that attention in her family was something you had to earn, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. There had always been someone better, someone more accomplished, someone who made things easier for everyone else. She had stopped competing a long time ago, not because she didn't care, but because she realized it wouldn't change anything. The expectations placed on her had always felt heavier, and the recognition lighter, as if no matter what she did, it would never be enough to shift the way she was seen. Eventually, she left, not in a dramatic way, not with a confrontation or a final argument, but quietly, choosing distance over disappointment. Years passed without real contact, only occasional messages that felt more like obligations than genuine attempts to reconnect. At some point, it became easier to assume that her absence had been accepted, maybe even preferred. She built her own life away from that space, creating something stable, something she could control, even if it lacked warmth. By the time she arrived at the rooftop, the city had already settled into the night. The air was cooler up there, the noise softer, replaced by low conversations and the distant hum of traffic below. They were seated near the edge, where the skyline stretched wide and uninterrupted, and for a moment she let herself relax into it. Her husband leaned back in his chair, looking around with a quiet smile, saying something about how they should have done this sooner, and she nodded, not because she fully agreed, but because it felt easier than explaining what she couldn't quite put into words. For a brief stretch of time, things felt normal. They talked about small things, shared a few memories, even laughed once or twice, without forcing it. It was subtle, but it was there, a version of themselves that hadn't completely disappeared, just buried under everything they hadn't said. Erin found herself watching him as he spoke, noticing details she had stopped paying attention to. The way he paused before finishing a sentence, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Then, without meaning to, her gaze drifted away from the table, scanning the space around them, not searching for anything specific, just letting her attention move freely for once. Then her attention shifted. Erin's gaze moved across the rooftop, without intention at first, until something at the far side of the terrace made her pause mid-motion. At a table slightly separated from the rest, a man sat leaning forward, his posture familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten before her mind even confirmed why. He was speaking quietly to a woman seated opposite him, their heads close enough that the conversation felt private, despite the open space around them. The city lights behind them reflected off the glass railing, framing the scene in a way that looked almost staged. Except nothing about what Erin was feeling in that moment felt artificial. She didn't move at first. Her eyes stayed fixed, trying to resolve the image into something else. Something ordinary. Something harmless. But the longer she looked, the less it shifted. There was a certainty forming that she did not want to accept, one that pressed against her thoughts until it became impossible to ignore. The man's profile turned slightly as he spoke again, and that small movement removed every remaining doubt. It was her father. Erin's breath caught so abruptly that she had to grip the edge of the table without realizing it. Her husband noticed the change immediately, asking her something she couldn't fully process, his voice sounding distant, almost disconnected from what was unfolding in front of her. She didn't answer. Her focus narrowed completely on the table across the rooftop, where her father continued talking as if nothing in the world could interrupt him. The woman across from him smiled softly, leaning in as he gestured with a calmness that felt unsettlingly natural. Erin felt a sharp contradiction rise inside her, because nothing about the man she was watching matched the version she had carried in her memory for years. In her mind, he had always been distant but stable, present but unreachable, someone who existed more as a fixed point in her life than an active part of it. Yet here he was, behaving with an ease she had never seen directed toward her family. Her thoughts began to fracture between recognition and disbelief. And the longer she stayed silent, the more the moment started to feel unreal. Her husband turned his head fully now, following her gaze, and his expression changed as soon as he understood what she was looking at. He didn't speak immediately, as if waiting for confirmation that this was exactly what it appeared to be. Erin finally moved, slowly reaching into her bag without taking her eyes off the table. Her fingers found her phone almost mechanically, not driven by thought, but by something more immediate and unstable. She raised it slightly, keeping it low enough to avoid attention while framing the scene in front of her. The screen lit up, and she began recording without fully deciding when that choice had been made. Her hand trembled subtly, though she tightened her grip to steady it, capturing each movement across the table with a focus that felt detached from emotion. Her father laughed at something, the woman said, unaware of the distance that was forming between him and everything around him in that exact moment. Erin's husband leaned closer and asked again what she was doing. This time, more urgent, but she still didn't respond. Her attention was fixed entirely on the screen and the reality it was preserving. Every second felt compressed, like time itself had slowed just enough to make the act irreversible. She stopped recording only after a short while, lowering the phone and staring at the footage without fully registering what she had captured. The rooftop noise returned faintly to her awareness, but it felt separate now, as if she had stepped outside of it. Her thumb moved across the screen before she fully processed the decision, and the message was sent without hesitation. She did not speak, but the silence around her had already shifted into something heavier than words could explain. Time seemed to lose its usual structure after that moment. Erin stayed seated without speaking, her eyes fixed on the rooftop entrance, even though nothing was happening there yet. The phone in her hand felt unusually heavy, as if the simple act of sending a message had changed its physical weight. Around her, conversations continued at other tables, but she wasn't processing any of it anymore. Her husband leaned slightly toward her and asked again what exactly she had seen. His tone quieter now, more cautious, but she still didn't respond. Not because she didn't hear him, but because answering would force her to define something she was not ready to define. Minutes stretched in a way that made it impossible to tell whether they were passing quickly or not at all. She checked her phone without realizing she was doing it, not for a reply, but out of habit that had turned into tension. The screen remained unchanged, and that absence of response created a pressure that kept building inside her without release. She noticed small details around her that she normally wouldn't care about, like the way the glass reflected, moving lights from the city, or how laughter from nearby tables sounded slightly too loud. Her husband shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the silence she had created around them. He looked in the direction she had been focused on earlier, trying to understand what had triggered this change in her behavior, but he didn't push further. Something about her expression told him this was not a moment that could be solved with questions. Erin, however, was no longer fully present at the table. Her thoughts kept circling the same point, not moving forward, not resolving, just returning. Then the atmosphere around them subtly changed. It wasn't immediate or dramatic, but there was a shift in the way nearby conversations dipped in volume for a second before resuming. Erin noticed it before she understood it. Her attention moved instinctively toward the entrance again, and this time it stayed there. A figure had appeared at the top of the staircase leading onto the rooftop, pausing just long enough to scan the space. The posture was controlled, deliberate, and even from a distance. There was something about it that made Erin's body react before her mind fully processed what she was seeing. Her breathing tightened slightly as recognition formed. The woman standing there was her mother. She had arrived without hesitation, moving forward with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension building. Inside the rooftop space, Erin watched as her mother's eyes adjusted, scanning, table after table with a focused stillness that felt almost surgical in its precision. There was no rush in her movement, no visible emotional display, only direction. When her gaze finally locked onto the table where Aaron sat, everything else around them seemed to lose importance. Her mother did not react outwardly, not immediately. Instead, she held her position for a brief moment, as if confirming what she was seeing, rather than responding to it. Aaron felt her body go still in a way that was not intentional. Her husband noticed the change in the atmosphere, but didn't yet understand its source. Her mother began walking forward. Each step was measured, not hesitant but controlled, as if she had already decided how this moment would unfold before she ever entered the building. The surrounding noise of the rooftop seemed to dull as she moved through it, not because it disappeared, but because Aaron's awareness of it was fading under the weight of what was approaching. Aaron remained seated, unable to decide whether to stand or stay still. Her grip on the edge of the table tightened slightly as her mother closed the distance between them, the space that had once felt normal, now narrowing into something that felt unavoidable and absolute. The distance between them collapsed before anyone spoke. Aaron watched as her mother arrived at the table, stopping just close enough that every detail of the scene became unavoidable. The woman across from her father shifted slightly in her seat, suddenly aware that the situation had changed in a way that could not be ignored or softened. Her father looked up slowly, his expression altering the moment recognition set in. But he did not stand immediately. Instead, he remained seated for a brief second longer, as if measuring what this moment required from him. Aaron stayed back at her table, frozen in place, unable to step forward, yet unable to look away. Her mother was the first to speak, her voice controlled, but edged with something sharp that had clearly been building long before this night. She did not raise her tone. Yet every word carried enough weight to silence the surrounding noise. She asked how long this had been happening, not as a question seeking explanation, but as one demanding acknowledgement. Her father exhaled, edged slowly, leaning back slightly in his chair, his hands no longer touching the table. The woman beside him looked between them, uncertain whether she should remain or disappear from the situation entirely. But no one addressed her yet. Aaron noticed how quickly attention in the rooftop shifted outward, people nearby beginning to sense that something personal and irreversible was unfolding just a few steps away from them. Her mother took another step closer, her posture steady, but her hands tense at her sides. She spoke again, this time mentioning the silence at home, the distance that had grown without warning in her eyes, and the feeling of being replaced by something she could not name. Her words were not scattered or emotional in the way Aaron expected. Instead, they were structured, precise, as if she had rehearsed them in moments of private realization she had never shared with anyone. Her father finally stood up, the chair scraping lightly against the floor in a sound that cut through the rooftop atmosphere. He did not match her intensity. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was controlled, almost too controlled, as if he had already decided how much emotion he was willing to show. He responded by asking her to stop. Assuming what she thought she understood, his voice steady but firm. That response only tightened the air between them. Aaron felt her stomach sink as she realized neither of them was speaking from surprise anymore. This was something that had been building long before tonight. Her mother's gaze flicked briefly toward the woman sitting beside him, and for the first time, the uncertainty in that woman's expression turned into discomfort that could no longer be hidden. Aaron's father followed that glance, but did not react outwardly. Instead, he turned his attention back to his wife, asking her why she had come here in this way, as if the setting itself was part of the problem, rather than the situation unfolding within it. The conversation around them became fragmented, as nearby tables began to quiet further, people pretending not to listen while clearly doing the opposite. Erin's husband remained seated beside her, no longer asking questions, only observing the exchange with a fixed focus. Erin's breathing felt shallow, not because of fear alone, but because the dynamic in front of her no longer resembled the version of her family she had carried for years. It was not collapsing in a single moment. It was revealing itself piece by piece, in ways she had never been allowed to see before. Her mother spoke again, this time lowering her voice. But the intensity did not fade, she said. She had tried to hold the family together in ways no one noticed, pointing out the distance that had grown slowly over time. Not from one decision, but from countless ignored moments. Her father did not interrupt this time. He listened without moving, without reacting, as if weighing each sentence instead of defending against it. Erin remained still, the phone still in her hand, though she was no longer aware of holding it. The rooftop felt smaller now, not physically but socially, as if every person there had been pulled into a space they did not belong to but could not leave. The silence that followed her mother's words stretched without resolution, leaving everything suspended in a state that was neither confrontation nor conclusion, but something in between that no one was ready to define. What followed did not begin with shouting, but with clarity that no one wanted. Erin stayed where she was, unable to move as her father finally shifted his attention fully away from denial and toward explanations. The rooftop noise felt distant now, as if the space around their table had become sealed off from everything else. Her father looked at her mother for a long moment before speaking, not with urgency, but with a controlled calm that made every word feel heavier than emotion. He said this was not something that started that night, and not something that could be reduced to what was being assumed in front of them. Erin noticed how her mother's posture stiffened, not in anger anymore, but in anticipation of something she did not fully trust. Her father explained that for a long time their marriage had already shifted into something neither of them had openly acknowledged. He described it not as a sudden break, but as a slow separation that had taken place in silence, through years of missed conversations and repeated distance that neither side had repaired. He said, as the woman sitting beside him was not a secret he had recently created, but someone who had been part of his professional life for years, a business partner who had gradually become the only person he could speak to without feeling dismissed or unheard. Erin watched her mother's expression change slightly, not softening, but losing the certainty she had carried when she arrived. The woman at the table finally spoke briefly, not defending herself, but, clarifying her position in a voice that was careful and restrained. She explained that her connection to Erin's father had developed through work long before anything personal was ever involved, and that the assumptions being formed in that moment did not reflect how the relationship had actually existed over time. Erin felt an uncomfortable shift inside her, because nothing in the explanation, resembled the version of events she had built in her mind just minutes earlier. Her mother interrupted, for the first time since the explanation began, her voice lower now, asking why none of this had ever been said at home, why silence had been allowed to replace truth until it reached a point where it had to be exposed in public. Her father responded by saying that every attempt to speak had been met with deflection, that conversations had been delayed repeatedly until they stopped happening entirely. He did not raise his voice, but the weight of his words carried a sense of exhaustion rather than accusation. Erin noticed something she had not expected. The confrontation was no longer about a single moment or a single person, but about a pattern of separation that had existed long before she had ever decided to record anything. Her father added that legal separation had already been discussed privately, not as a threat, but as a conclusion they had been moving toward without naming it. That statement shifted the atmosphere again, not into resolution, but into recognition that what was unfolding was not preventable anymore. Her mother stood still, absorbing the informations without immediate response, as if every assumption she had brought with her was being rearranged in real time. Erin remained silent, the phone still in her hand, no longer feeling like it belonged to the moment. The distance between everyone at the table was no longer physical, but defined by everything that had been said and everything that could not be taken back. No one moved to close it, because at that point, it was no longer something that could be closed. After everything at the rooftop settled into an uneasy silence that no one tried to break, the consequences of that night began unfolding in ways none of them could control. Erin did not leave immediately, even though part of her wanted to disappear from the entire situation. She remained seated as her phone stayed in her hand, now useless in a way she had not anticipated when she first pressed record. The conversation behind her had shifted from confrontation into something slower, more final, as if decisions were being made without needing to be spoken aloud again. Her mother had moved away from the table at some point, no longer engaged in the argument, but carrying with her a certainty that had replaced all confusion. Her father stayed longer, not because there was more to say, but because leaving required acknowledging that nothing here would return to what it had been before. The next hours did not feel like a continuation of the night, but like the beginning of a separate timeline. Erin and her husband left the rooftop without discussing what had happened in any meaningful way. Words felt insufficient, and anything spoken would have sounded incomplete compared to what they had just witnessed. Later that night, she received messages she did not immediately open, followed by silence that stretched into the next day. When she finally learned what had occurred after she left, it was not through explanation, but through fragments of information that arrived separately, each one adding structure to something already breaking apart. Her parents did not return to the same home that night. Her mother stayed elsewhere, choosing distance over immediate resolution. Legal discussions that had only been mentioned in passing during the confrontation now turned into formal steps, involving separation agreements and financial arrangements that required clarity rather than emotion. Her father moved into temporary housing, not hiding, but no longer attempting to maintain the appearance of continuity. The woman from the rooftop remained outside the center of their family conflict, her involvement, limited to her own relationship boundaries, which she quietly stepped away from as the situation expanded beyond what she had expected. Erin found herself in the middle of everything, without being part of the decisions being made. Her younger brother reacted differently than she did, refusing to accept the situation at first, then withdrawing completely when explanations failed to restore any sense of stability. The family structure she had known no longer functioned in any recognizable way, not because of a single event, but because that event had exposed divisions that had been present long before anyone admitted them. In the days that followed, Erin returned to her routine, but it no longer felt anchored. Work continued. Conversations happened, and life moved forward externally, yet, internally, everything felt displaced. She replayed the sequence of that night repeatedly, not focusing on what she had seen, but on what had led to the point where seeing it had become possible. Her thoughts kept returning to the distance that had existed in her family long before she had chosen to record anything, a distance that had been normalized until it became invisible. There were no dramatic reunions or sudden reconciliations. Instead, there were legal confirmations, separate residences, and conversations handled through third parties. The family name remained the same, but the structure behind it no longer existed in the way it once had. Erin's role in what happened was never officially addressed, but she carried the weight of it privately, not as guilt alone, but as awareness that she had accelerated something already in motion. At some point, she began to understand that what she had witnessed was not the destruction of a single moment, but the exposure of a long-term breakdown that no one had been willing to define earlier. She reflected on how easily perception can replace truth when distance grows slowly enough to feel normal. In her own words, spoken later in a private reflection, she admitted that families do not collapse. In a single instant, they dissolve through silence, avoidance, and delayed honesty until one moment finally reveals what has already been lost. She ended with a thought she could not ignore, that the hardest part was not what she saw that night, but realizing how long she had been part of a system where no one was truly listening. Where no one was truly listening until everything was already too far gone to repair.